right. Hello, everyone. I'm James Cowie from Renesys, and the topic today is this curious incident that some of you probably remember from 7 November. I worked on the analysis for this with Andrew Hobgood from Renesys. I should also mention that this is based on a huge pile of data, as you'll see, much of which was collected by Clint Hepner, who's at home in New Hampshire, and Alex Colvin, who's actually here today. So cheers to them. Just quickly for level setting, how many of you remember exactly where you were at 9:09 and 30 seconds Eastern Time on 7 November 2011? Show of hands. Wow, non-zero. Okay. For context, who remembers the big event was blamed in the popular press on a Junos bug that caused the internet basically to fail rather widely for about 20 minutes on this particular day? Does it ring some bells? Okay. This is good. I like to see that you remember this, because otherwise I'm talking about something that you don't remember. What we're going to go through today is the first chance that Renesys has had to talk about this event, which was certainly a unique event. It's odd for us to take so long to address an event like this. Usually we come out with a blog. You'll notice we never blogged on this. And part of the reason is that, well, as you'll see, it was a really strange event. It took a lot of analysis, and a lot of the time we spent going through this was deciphering what it had not been. And we actually ended up inventing some new tools to figure out what it was, or what it probably was. So just to take you through to a day in the life at Renesys, you can imagine what this is like. In the old days, we used to have a lot more big events, internet-wide events, where the internet would sag and everybody would have a bad day. And largely through your efforts, the operator community, those days are now few and far between. But on this particular day, something really bad happened to the internet. And in the first few minutes of incident response, that's kind of what you start hearing, right? You're out there on IRC, you start to see traffic on the NANOG list, you see outages pop up, people are tweeting, something really bad has happened to, I think they said level 3. And everything's going wrong, nobody knows what's going on. It's bad for me because at Renesys I know exactly what's going to happen next. And the fact that I know what's coming makes it worse. So somebody out there is going to write in and say, does Renesys have a report ready for this yet? This is 15 minutes later, Dave. Okay? This incident, 15 minutes, right? The instability is still raging, everything's going wrong. So actually, we did have a report. I had a small wooden ball that had arrived in my office with the identifying prefix engraved on it. It was courtesy of the Renesys pre-routing team. They knew about this. We had the report already written. No, that's not how it happens. Seriously, we all start at the same point of confusion. We start at 14:09:30 UTC. People are saying it's level 3. Wait, it's not just level 3, it's Tata. Wait, it's everybody. Okay, everybody's losing transatlantic traffic. People are losing traffic all over the world. Turk Telecom is having problems. Everybody's having problems. We lose about 7% of all of our BGP peers in the first 10 minutes. And we have hundreds of BGP peers, as many of you do. So here's the first symptom, right? If you've watched a Renesys presentation before, you've seen this curve. This used to happen in 2001 and 2003, and it used to be worms, right? We'd have SQL Slammer that would cause so much traffic that BGP would get crowded out, and we'd lose keep alives, and then sessions would crash. And you'd see something that looked just like that. This huge surge of BGP prefix updates, advertisements from everything all over the world coming in is a 30-second rate. So recently, the way that this happens is not a worm, it's probably a router bug. And so we started digging into the huge pile of updates, trying to figure out what were the common things we could find. And we've seen lots of these, especially in the 2009, 2010, there seemed to be a rash of them. And you'll probably remember a lot of these as having ruined your day. Long AS paths full of 4-byte ASs. Empty attributes, weird compliant but ugly things that get sent out and somebody doesn't like them and it tickles a bug and they reset their sessions. We didn't find it. And we looked at all the appearances of attributes, we looked at statistical distributions of all the features that all these updates have, and there was just no pattern. And so we said, it must be a new kind of cyber nuke. I did not invent this phrase, I merely exploit it. Cyber nuke is when one major vendor has done something wrong. They failed to recognize a corner case, right? And the other vendors didn't. And so what happens is it's kind of like epidemiology. You have a problem, starts somewhere in the world, it doesn't matter where, and everybody who doesn't have that bug propagates it gloriously to everybody who does have that bug. And so within about 30 seconds, everybody on Earth who's vulnerable is going to suffer whatever effects this causes. And BGP goes to hell. It looks like that. So we dug in, as we are wont to do. We took a look at the distribution of newly unstable prefixes. So here are individual prefixes in the table which were stable up until the last minute or so, and suddenly they're unstable. And we look at this onset, and we break it out by geolocated country. And what you basically see is a cross-section of the internet. So the US is the biggest part of that, but there's a lot of networks in the US. It's not really something obvious that's geographically local. So we take a look at the upstreams. We take a look at all the AS paths. Try to figure out if there's any particular AS. We were hoping to find somebody simple like level 3. Oh, it's a level 3 problem. No. Broad spectrum instability. Almost every provider has some instability in their customer cone. There's no smoking gun. Okay, at this point I'm realizing that we may not be able to write the blog the same day. So what did we do? We actually had to go out as we looked at this and for days failed to find what it was that was the problem. We were hearing from the popular press what people thought it was, but we had to tie it back to data. So we ended up actually inventing some tools to figure out what this might be. So we have a distributed traceroute data set. I think this is the first time we're talking about its use for events like this, but this was the idea of having a distributed traceroute data set. We have some number of dozens of collection points here, there, and everywhere around the world. We are trace routing to as many IPs as we can find that will respond. So nearly 1 million of them every day. We do, I think it was about 8 billion in the last year. And traceroute is a pretty coarse tool for doing network measurement, but in the aggregate it tells you pretty interesting things. So here's a metric that you can use, non-completion rate. Let's measure how often the guy we're trace routing to fails to respond. If that changes, somebody is impaired, and we can figure out through careful analysis who that might be. So of course, traceroute analysis, many of you have done it. It's difficult. You have to be lucky enough to have the right kinds of traces in flight at the time of the event, because we can't predict that these things happen unless we have the pre-routing team in the tank. You have a big diversity problem, right? You really have to have a lot of traceroute collectors in order to factor out all of the collector side problems that might be affecting one or more of my traceroute collectors in various data centers. And perhaps for this event, it's important to note that this event is only about 20 minutes long. Boom, it goes, it rockets to a high level of instability, it exponentially repairs itself, and in about 20 minutes it's kind of over. And so there's not a huge baseline here, but you can see the signal. Hey, it looks kind of like the BGP update curve. Same timestamp. Simultaneous worldwide increase in rate of failure. It's about double in 30 seconds. And each individual line you can see there is one of our traceroute collectors reporting its non-completion rate off of a baseline. There is a global baseline. You don't expect all targets to respond to a trace, but the rate of failure here just goes off the charts and then comes right back, and it decays. And pretty soon it's kind of back to its long-term baseline. So we dug into this, and here's where you realize why it took a long time for us to talk about this. We took 34 million trace routes that we happen to have had in flight during those first 15 hours leading up to the event. We identified in each trace route pairs of router interfaces in the path that were both reliably crossed by our traces before the event and then not reliably crossed in the first 10 minutes after. So that gives you a nice subset to take a look at. There's about 28,000 of these edges where we had really good coverage viewing their availability. And then we take the intersection. We look at who is highly traversed and who was highly impaired. And when this was accepted, one of the conditions was that there not be any math. So I'm going to violate that, but only very slightly. Here's what we did. We made a matrix in which the rows are individual ASs that we are tracing across, right? People who appear in the AS paths of the prefixes that hold the IPs that we were tracing to. The columns are common 30-second timestamps forming a basis, so this is a signal matrix. And we did an SVD to identify the primary sources of variance. You can see them there on the left in the colorfulness. The top lines there are illustrating the primary ways that all of these AS's trace counts are varying together as we walk through these 15 hours. And fortunately for the analysis, you can see that the event that takes place is very prominently visible. It is the primary thing happening on the internet in these 15 hours. You can see that trace counts basically drop and struggle back to base. You know that we got it all because you can look at the next few right singular vectors, and you can see that there are periodic noise there. It's probably some things that came out of our traceroute collection, little spiky periodic things, but basically we got the entire signal in the first 3 or 4. We take on the right a scatter plot. We take all the ASs and we find out how well they correlate with the first ones, right? So you're trying to figure out which ASs had trace count signals that look pretty much like the clear signal of the event. And again, thank goodness we found that providers like Tata and Level 3 and Comcast and Roadrunner and AT&T were the ones that actually had reachability impairment in the data that looks a lot like the story that was then going around in the chat rooms. So we can dig in again. We can do the same trick. Pull out a single provider. Take all of the edges in the traceroute graph, that is all the router interface pairs of which at least one is a level 3 router, and let's do the matrix thing again. Let's normalize it. Let's do the SVD and find out which ones of the level 3 edges in their network correlated strongly with these strongest signals of impairment. And you get a nice subset. So out of the heavily traversed 3,100 router edges that we took a look at, there are about 650 in this first 10 minutes. And if you dig into those, you find about 84% of those are just internal edges. They're on level 3's network. It's between a level 3 router and a level 3 router, as you might expect. The rest are out on the edge, facing peers and customers who are feeling a little bit of whatever this was. And because we know where the routers are, to some extent, we can make a breakdown of where the heaviest impacts were being felt. And again, it sort of jibes with the stories we were hearing. Los Angeles, San Jose, Frankfurt, London. So you get unusual people like Turk Telecom having significant problems, ostensibly because they are connecting to level 3 in Frankfurt, let's say. And at that point, there is some transient, let's call it impairment, which of course comes back very quickly. You can do the same analysis, I won't go into the details again, but with Tata. So provider by provider, we're working through finding the sets of interfaces that we think were really hurt by this. 70% of these 300 edges are are internal Tata. The rest are spread over peers and customers. Again, New York, Los Angeles, US East and West Coast, also London, right? Tata's network. As you would expect, there's some impact in Singapore and Hong Kong and Mumbai. And the people that are impaired as you'd expect. If you take a look at this, we're going back now to the original data. We're saying how many traces had a responding destination. This is that response metric again that's nice and simple. And you see, as I pull out these 6 providers, you see the signal. Others don't look like this. You can see that some of them are very direct and they have the same shape of outage and recovery like level 3, Tata, Roadrunner. And then you see others like Turk Telecom who have a recognizable modification of that signal, but it's not as sharp because they're downstream of the presumed problem. All right, a lot of traceroute mining. Back to BGP, which is my comfort zone. Let's go looking for the root cause. Now, I'm going to be the first to tell you that there is no final root cause to be had in this deck because this is about correlation and observation. Here's my favorite metaphor for this technique. How many of you, as a kid, really liked thermonuclear weapons design? Yes. I'm not surprised, Patrick. Yeah. Everybody? Okay. This is a beautiful device. I think this is the Castle-Bravo test. You can see the primary, the fission primaries on the right, and there's the lithium deuteride secondary on the left. Okay. There are light pipes coming off of this thing. The way that they studied these explosions was that in the very first microseconds, there are pipes literally to carry the light away from the detonation so you can study it down at the end of the bunker before your equipment gets vaporized. This is my metaphor. This is what we did. We dug into this signal, and you can see it go boom. We wanted to dig into the first seconds of this thing and figure out exactly what was going on here. Okay? First thing everybody always tells you when you're starting to do BGP research at the university is don't mistake session resets for signal. Yeah, it's true. You know, every time a BGP session resets, you get the full table, and it looks like a big signal, but it's not. It's just a reset. So here you can see, actually, that the light blue is our peers who are not resetting. This is all collateral damage. Stuff has gone away somewhere else, and we're seeing the reconvergence noise of people trying to find the best routes that don't exist anymore. And then only a couple minutes later do we start to see a rumble, like a secondary wave of resets from our peers. And we rule them out of this analysis. So let's take a look. Here's a technique that we've used in the presentations before. Each black square here is the entire internet. Okay, this is the measurement factory XKCD kind of modeling tool where you use a Hilbert curve, the space-filling curve, to map out the entire IPv4 address space in a rectangle. And so if you could see this at full resolution, each pixel is a /24 belonging to somebody. And here we are looking at 30-second snapshots in the first 7 minutes. And you can see the first light coming out of the light pipe right as this thing goes off. And it's at 14:09:30. We can do a 10x zoom, okay? Now this is the first 30 seconds, that rectangle from the previous slide. Now we're looking at it in 3-second slices. So each one of these is a 3-second picture of the entire internet. And again, you can see it lighting up. The red box contains 9 seconds of data, and we're going to go diving in there to try to figure out where this came from. This is a log scale plot of 3 candidates that kind of fell out of the analysis as possible places this might have come from. We're looking at the advertisement rate per second in BGP from all of our peers, log scale. There are basically 3 here. We thought it might be Sodatel in Beirut, or Tikhona in Mumbai, or possibly the Ukrainian Academic Research Net in Kiev. You can see they're all plotted there in my best GNU plot. And the box there, the rectangle, is that first 9 seconds. So the thing you note about this is that the wave, the leading edge of this signal is not horizontal, it's not vertical, meaning it's not simultaneous. There is a leading edge. And the earliest light here comes from Tikhona in Mumbai, a large access network. I think they're a WiMAX provider, very large network, and as you'll see, a lot of prefixes in the table. It's so bright at this point that in the first 2 seconds, we see 28,000 advertisements just for Tikhona. Okay? In fact, at that rate, for just the 2 seconds, first 2 seconds of the event, they're brighter than the rest of the internet. The brown here is everybody else except Tikhona. The blue is Tikhona, one provider. So there's a couple samples there where they are brighter than everybody else. Now notice that after this initial flash, they fade, and the rest of the internet comes up as being unstable. If you zoom right in, I mean, it's very clear that something extraordinary has happened, and they were the first on the scene. Again, we're sort of accumulating circumstantial evidence. So what's so neat about Tikhona is that basically they have 2 big blocks that they allocate out of. One is this 113.193/16, which they've had for quite a while. And the more interesting one, that's in blue, the more interesting one is in red, which is this slice, the /15 out of 1 dot. A few of you are nodding, because you know that interesting things happen in 1 dot. This is their recent acquisition, and you can see that over time, as they build out, presumably their wireless infrastructure all over India, they're using pieces of this. They're putting /24s into the table. And you can see that in recent history, it gets pretty darn spiky, meaning that they are periodically deaggregating and reaggregating and deaggregating and reaggregating and creating this routing instability. So why does that matter? Well, there was this, okay? So months before this happened, there was this quiet little announcement that there was a vulnerability in Junos, that the router could actually crash if it received very specific, very unlikely install and delete actions. The set of route prefix updates is non-deterministic and exceedingly unlikely to occur. A complex sequence of preconditions is required to trigger this crash. I'm not saying that to make fun of them, I just love the sound of it. There's no harm in that, right? We're all friends. It's interesting because what might have happened here, and I'm going to kind of leave you with this hypothesis because since this is the first time we've shown this in public, I'm also looking for the operator feedback to tell me if I'm wildly wrong, is that the bursty deaggregation of that one dot space may have accidentally recreated the trigger conditions for that bug, which, as I understand it, was very similar to the bug that any of you will have seen if you've written code to analyze large numbers of BGP updates where you're using something like a Patricia try, and you're trying to put things in and take them out and keep track of them as they nest. There are corner cases that are really easy to write in code like that that can cause terrible problems. I don't know that that's the case, but it looks like something I could empathize with. If in fact this was the trigger, it would make sense because their transit providers were Vodafone India and Bharti, which were largely unaffected, and Tata. And eventually, as you go through the graph of how they're connected, this would have hit level 3, and everything would have gone off the rails. So I present this without direct evidence. It is still a hypothesis, but it's my best working theory at the moment. So if I summarize this, I think the summary here is it really could have been worse. I'm glad we don't see these internet-wide sags anymore, except on very rare events. I think what smells like what happened here is that vulnerability description, as you read it, was very clear about the remoteness of the probability of tickling that bug. And I think what may have happened is that many of you took a look at that and rationally said, well, I'm not going to schedule a special maintenance to take care of that. I'll just wait and pick it up the next time it comes around. But there is this law of large numbers. Anything that can happen on the internet eventually will happen on the internet. And it took several months to recreate the situation, but I think it happened. And then you were all forced with the necessity of doing this again, under pressure during East Coast business hours and the whole deal. And so, you pay now or you pay later. The critical thing I think to remember here is if this was in fact the bug where you have to apply route updates in a particular order and then pull them off again and then apply some more and pull them off and then you hit the corner case, it's good because what it means is when these things rebooted, they didn't just come up, get the same update, the poison update back in their input and then die. Because if that had happened, this could have lasted for hours. Instead, basically we got one reboot. Everybody took a reboot, went down, came back, loaded up, all good, keep going. And so the duration was mercifully limited to about this 20-minute period. So I think we got lucky. That's it, and I'll take your questions.
West George, Time Warner Cable. I think one of the takeaways that we got from this was that there's sort of a hole right now in the way that we find these bugs. When we do our certification testings, either in the vendor testing and their unit testing and things like that, in any more specific testing that they do to try and replicate one of their carrier customer networks, or the testing that we do internally to certify things before they go out in the wild. I'm not saying that we could have done some test that would have found this bug, right, or any such thing, but what it's kind of getting towards for me is I'm wondering if maybe we need to be, as a community, focusing a little harder on sort of a protocol fuzzing kind of thing within BGP to try and poke at it a little more and find some of these things in a slightly more controlled environment. I don't know whether, how we would go about that, whether it's, throw weird ass things at it and see when it soils the bed, or whether there's something else we need to do. But I,
Right.
wanted to kind of bring that up for if other folks have ideas or if you do.
It's a good point. I think that this, I give, if in fact it was Juniper's issue, I give them credit, that it was really a very remote possibility that this would be triggered. And so in some sense, at some point you have to change over your strategy from zero defect to resilience and recovery. And whatever you are doing presumably worked pretty well, because after that one reboot cycle, everything converged. And we went on our way. It's not like the old days where we could have been down for days if somebody did the wrong thing. So I agree with the sentiment that at some point the discussion becomes about resilience.
Brian Deerdorf, level 3. I just want to say that you're correct about the address space that it was out of. So
Sweet.
That's good. The other thing is we did try to. I had the sequence from a couple of minutes before, and we tried to replay it in our lab, and we were unsuccessful in recreating it. So.
And that's really lucky, because my fear was, oh, it's the equivalent of a 0 day, right? This will be weaponized tomorrow, and then everybody who didn't do the upgrade is going to get taken behind the barn. But that's cool that you couldn't make it happen again.
Yeah, that was my concern, is that I didn't want to distribute the TCP dump that I had, and I had a concern that it could be weaponized, I guess. But I was happy that we were not able to reproduce it.
Me too.
Joel Yeagley. I think one of the things that I get from this and a lot of other events that we've sort of experienced in the real world is it calls into question for me our ability to properly put error bars on improbable events. Particularly in this case, the event itself may be really improbable, but the transitive nature of the impact of it means that it only has to happen once. And so, it could be a 6 or a 7 or an 8 or a 9 sigma event, and it could still actually happen once, and that would be all that it takes. So I think that places us in an interesting place as far as risk goes. I would like to think that the system that we have is robust because it's loosely coupled, and that its behavior, as you say, should be such that it's a rare event is not immediately repeatable. But I don't think we've arrived at something that would be the opposite of fragile, for example. So,
right. I think it's good. I mean, you have to come up with a rational response to how you're going to spend on stuff like this. Again, it's the question of how much you're prepared to spend to reach zero defect and, the 5-minute maintenance window. Oh, we discovered the fault, let's fix it.
Well, and I don't think zero defect is actually likely
no, it doesn't exist.
In any universe that we live in. So
not in this system. Unfortunately, I think the mass media and the culture at large is catching up to us, because now they have also experienced some 3, 4, 5, 6 sigma events in the markets and so forth, and they are no longer doubters. That risk is important and it's difficult to deal with, and they don't put blind faith in the fact that we can just keep the internet up 24/7 for the rest of time. So good for us.
Rüdiger Volk, Deutsche Telekom. I wonder whether your reading of the global system did show to you a couple of other events around, say, just 2 months around that.
Given the timing of the previous advisory, I did go looking, and I did not find.
Okay, so let me tell you what saved us from actually participating in the flaps. We did see something like 3 distinct bugs that were remotely triggerable just at the end of September. And dealing with that stuff, and actually we know that a couple of other networks have been flapping sessions around the same events. Obviously not as bad as this. And well, okay, in the path of dealing with the bugs that we encountered, well, okay, we did some emergency upgrades back then, which included fixing this leak. Yeah, but kind of the interesting thing is there are actually so many events that show that the BGP system has vulnerabilities that can be triggered, that, well, okay, we can be lucky that the public press isn't really taking note of it.
I'll leave that there because we're out of time. That's a great point. Thank you.